what I like to do is to begin my presentation at the very end. The Polish Jewish artist Arthur Szyk died in 1951 in New Canaan, Connecticut. And during the last year of his life, which was over 70 years ago, he illuminated the statement of Thomas Jefferson: "I've sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." Szyk, who was born in Lodz, Poland in 1894, came to admire the American presidents, Jefferson, Washington, and Lincoln, and the ideals of freedom that they represented for humanity at large. As such, they also served as his inspiration in his commitment to fighting against tyranny and oppression directed against the Jews, his own people of Europe, and for their justice and their freedom. Arthur Szyk went on to become the leading anti-Nazi artist in America during World War II. My presentation this afternoon will tell that story, as I dedicate it to the hallowed memory of Europe's martyred Jews and the Holocaust survivors that are among us. In 1933, in the year that Hitler came to power, Arthur Szyk was invited to come to the United States for an exhibition of his works on freedom at the Library of Congress. You imagine, the year Hitler comes to power, Szyk is invited to show works of art dealing with freedom to the American people. These works were exhibited at the Library of Congress, and he was awarded for these works on freedom the George Washington Bicentennial Medal by the American Congress. Szyk arrived in New York on a cold, snowy day in December. He was already famous in the world, and he arrived with his wife, Julia, whom you can see in the upper left-hand corner. And when he arrived, he had been previously decorated for his works on freedom in the 1920s and early 30s by both the governments of Poland and France. An example of those works of freedom were his 38 paintings dealing with George Washington and the American Revolution, one of which is pictured here, all of which were completed by Arthur Szyk even before he visited America. And these works were exhibited in the White House. When in the United States, Szyk was asked about life in Europe, where he had been a World War I soldier, the director of art propaganda for Poland in its war against the Soviet Union. Picture this, a Jew, the head of Polish propaganda. He was a successful book illustrator in Europe, the artistic editorial contributor to newspapers, a campaigner for democracy, and a fighter against anti-Semitism, a defender of Jewish rights. This is in the 1920s and 30s. In one newspaper interview of Arthur Szyk in 1934, Szyk emphatically stated, "An artist, and especially a Jewish artist, cannot be neutral in these times. Our life is involved in a terrible tragedy, and I am resolved to serve my people with all of my art, with all of my talent, and with all of my knowledge." Arthur Szyk in 1934. In July of 1934, after 7 months in America, Szyk returned to Lodz, Poland. It was then that he began to illustrate his famous Passover Haggadah, conscious of his commitment to serve his people with all of his art and all of his talent. It was this time he sat down to illustrate the great book of freedom, 1934. His Haggadah was going to be different than anyone else's Haggadah up until that point and beyond. For Arthur Szyk saw Hitler as the new Pharaoh and the Nazis as the new Egyptians who had come to degrade, restrict, punish, dehumanize, and annihilate the Jews of Europe. Szyk's caricature on the right shows Hitler standing atop the Reichstag with a Nazi salute while holding an olive branch in his other hand. Don't trust a wolf in sheep's clothing is one of Szyk's many published responses to Nazism in the early 1930s. In fact, Szyk also used to say, never trust a wolf that promises to be a vegetarian. Szyk's Haggadah contained a wicked son, which is the image in the upper left, who looks very German and Hitler-esque with a Hitler mustache, as can be seen here with the pointer. He painted swastikas in his Haggadah on the Egyptians, and a Nazi armband was on the wicked son, both of which were required by his publisher to be removed and painted over prior to the Haggadah's first publication in London in 1940. I might add here that his Haggadah in 1940 was the most expensive new book in the world and sold for the equivalent of $500 at that time. And if you're living somewhere in New Jersey, you might be able to buy a house for $500. That's how expensive his Haggadah was. And that only happens because he was incredibly well known and famous at the time. Szyk's Haggadah dedication, which I'll show here, is without parallel in all Haggadahs. You won't see anything like it. Many of you, to make you even more involved and closer to what this illustration is, this is the dedication page for the Haggadah, no doubt have seen the movie that came out about 10 years ago that was called The King's Speech. It starred Colin Firth. It is that king, that George VI, to whom Szyk dedicated the Book of Freedom, his Haggadah. And he did it with these words: "At the feet of your most gracious majesty, I humbly lay these works of my hands, shewing forth the afflictions of my people Israel." But the question is, why would Szyk dedicate the Haggadah to the King of England? And for two reasons he would dedicate it. First, as Szyk finished his Haggadah paintings in Poland in 1936, he looked forward to traveling to England to supervise the printing of the Haggadah. Therefore, it makes sense to dedicate it to the British king. Secondly, and more importantly, Szyk saw England at the forefront of fighting the Nazis. Remember, America is not in the war until 5 years later. So it makes perfect sense to dedicate this Book of Freedom to the British. There's a problem with this dedication page. What's the problem? In 1936, the British had already begun to pass a series of white papers. That is, laws which restricted the flow and emigration, an exodus, and the freedom of the Jews to leave Europe. It limited their immigration to Palestine. The most well-known of these white papers came a little bit later with the 1939 MacDonald white paper. So how is Arthur Szyk going to be emotionally and intellectually honest in dedicating this great Book of Freedom to the British, who, while on the one hand will be fighting the Nazis who are descending on Europe, but on the other are simultaneously preventing the Jews from leaving Europe and finding security in the land of Israel? And here is what Szyk does. On the bottom right, where the cursor is, you will see here he paints European Jews whom he hopes will have an exodus from Egypt. Remember, this book is about the exodus of the ancient Israelites for Egypt. But Szyk is painting Jews who need to have an exodus to arrive, as on the bottom left, to Zion, the Hebrew word Zion, Zion, which is the land of Israel, painted on the gates of entering Jerusalem. And what he does is he paints between the Jews who want to leave Europe and go to the land of Israel. He paints in the very center a British military ship that stands between the Jews who are seeking freedom in the land of Israel, because it is the British who have passed this mandate which has restricted the flow of Jews to Israel. And on the bottom, you will note that Arthur Szyk paints his self-portrait in the bottom right, dressed in this green quasi-military garb, as he sees himself as a soldier in art. This is Arthur Szyk. This is an introduction to his Haggadah. And while the Haggadah is a book used on religious occasions and a Passover Seder, for Arthur Szyk, it is more than that. It is a political book about fighting against tyranny and oppression, and for freedom and for justice in every age, particularly at that hour. Szyk also completed, I'll add here, other dedication pages for the Haggadah, one of which is those in Hebrew dedicated to the Jews of Germany and Austria after the Anschluss and after Kristallnacht. He continued to remain vigilant on behalf of his people. And again, you will see here in the bottom center, he paints himself in military garb, again as a soldier in art. Here it may be hard to see, but that on his chest he has the 3 medals that he received as an artist for freedom by the Poles, by the French, and by the Americans. And remember, World War II has not officially begun, which does begin in September of 1939. And here one sees in 39, the Germans and the Russians invade Poland and World War II breaks out. Szyk's biting caricatures and graphic satire call attention to the brutality of both the Germans and the Russians. Father, do not forgive them, for they know what they do. And his art appeared in magazines and in newspapers and in prominent exhibitions, such as this one that was held in London at the Fine Arts Society in 1940. And in fact, in 1940, Szyk is in London, and there the Polish government in exile, which has moved from Poland to London, that government and the British government support the idea that Arthur Szyk should come to the United States in order that he will bring the face of the war in Europe to the Western world. And in fact, Szyk arrives first in Canada, where newspapers report that this famous artist has a price tag on his head. So well known was his anti-Nazi art that he was created in England before he came to the US. And while in Canada at an exhibition held in Toronto, Szyk is recognized for his art in the service of humanity. And while he is quoted as saying, and Szyk says, art must be mobilized like everything else. At the time of this Ottawa newspaper story on Szyk, his 38 paintings of freedom that I mentioned earlier were purchased by the President of Poland and given as a gift. These paintings on George Washington, the American Revolution, and freedom were given as a gift to Franklin Roosevelt, hung in the White House as a gift from the people of Poland to the people of the United States, with the idea that Szyk's art would serve as a bridge between Poland and America on the eve of World War II. Highly important, as Szyk's art continued to serve as a bridge between nations and, as you will see, between peoples. In late 1940, immigrants to America, almost immediately, Szyk, when he arrives in the United States, his art began to appear everywhere. At first serving as a warning to the people of America about the Nazi threat, and then to mobilize American war efforts. Szyk portrays a madman's dream. This is 1940, before the US enters the war, where Hitler is sitting on a throne, surrounded by the Axis supporters, the world almost at his lap, the Jew as the rug on the floor, the Untermensch, the subhuman, at Hitler's feet, while Uncle Sam and John Bull on the right, are representing America and England, are in chains as Szyk sees it, as this, because this is a madman's dream, which Szyk is clearly depicting for the American people well before the US enters the war. While This was published in Coronet magazine. Szyk warns America that if America doesn't pay attention, if America doesn't pay attention to what is going on at that time, this will be the result. This drawing by him, which appeared in the American Mercury magazine, again, before America enters the war. I have to pause for a minute. I'm getting a little excited here. In July of 1941, Szyk's book, The New Order, is published in New York. The first anti-Nazi book of its kind, attacking the Nazis' New Order. Contemporary art critic Thomas Craven writes, Szyk's designs are as compact as a bomb. Extraordinary lucid in statement, firm and incisive of line, and deadly in their caricaturizations. He concentrates his powers on people, on Hitler and his gang, fixing the guilt where it belongs and creating an immortal record of inhuman conduct and organized savagery. And among its pages, Szyk's New Order paints a picture of the defenseless and huddled Jews as enemies of the Third Reich, as Hitler sees them, as if to say, these are the enemies? These are the enemies? This is the threat to Germany? With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States declares war on Japan and 3 days later on Germany. And it is Arthur Szyk's art. It is Arthur Szyk's art, none other than Szyk, showing Yamamoto as the aggressor that appears on the front cover of Time magazine. This man was known by people, as I mentioned, in Poland and in France, but in America, Szyk is incredibly famous. You might even be asking the question, which you may want to ask me in the question and answer period afterwards. How about Ungar's painting a picture of a man so famous? How come I don't really know that much about him? How come I never heard about this guy even? Well, it's my job to make him more well-known, so continue to bear with me. The New York Post and the Chicago Sun are showing his art, and the newspaper PM, Collier's, Esquire, Look, Liberty, Time, all publish Szyk's artwork. I mean, his art is all over the place. You get up in the morning, you look at the New York Post, have your coffee and bagel, there's Arthur Szyk's art. You continue throughout the day, you'll see his art in billboards. You'll see it on poster stamps everywhere. The American Press and Click magazine here saw Szyk as a one-man army conducting a war against Hitler. The American military called Szyk a citizen soldier of the free world. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote about Szyk in her newspaper columns. Here he's dedicating stamps to FDR, who was a stamp collector. But also at the same time, in the work on the right, Szyk inscribes this portrait of Roosevelt to the American president, and he gives it as a gift to Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt from Arthur Szyk, FDR's soldier in art. And that is how Arthur Szyk saw himself. I might add that before Szyk came to America, and he was in Canada, as I indicated earlier, when he had to sign the papers of immigration and you put down what you do for a living, Arthur Szyk filled it out and said, I am a fighting artist. Those were his words, not just an artist, a fighting artist. When Norman Rockwell, who may resonate in some way with Szyk, but totally different, Szyk was painting, when Roosevelt was painting the covers, drawing the covers for the Saturday Evening Post, Szyk was an illustrator of another kind, the leading propagandist for the Allied cause. Szyk was illustrating the covers of Collier's magazine. Again, how well known was Szyk? Well, 3 million people saw every Roosevelt cover for the Post. 2.5 million people saw every cover Szyk did for Collier's. He was as well known as Rockwell, but even more so, and I hope that my presentation will even give you an indication of how so. I mean, his work was shown at 500 USO recreation centers. More than 1 million servicemen, GIs, saw his art. Everywhere was Arthur Szyk. Not only Eleanor Roosevelt writing about him and works in the White House, but his art was everywhere. And in addition to that, this cover here is the Labor Day cover for Collier's. And again, motivating Americans to work in supporting the war effort as the Nazi serpent on the right strangles these pillars of democracy. Szyk was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Axis and the other on behalf of his Jewish brethren. His mantra was clear. The Jewish artist belongs to the Jewish people, he wrote, and it is his mission to enhance the prestige of the Jews in the world. His task is to reveal to the world our glorious past and our tragic present. Szyk's motivation at all times, as should be ours, those leaders among us, to elevate the prestige of the Jews in the world as proud contributors to democracy and world civilization. We're running short of Jews, Hitler declares, as Goering and Goebbels are at the forefront of this image and Himmler stands there. The arm is raised. Gestapo reports that 2 million Jews have been murdered in 1943. Aha, the Nazis say, we've got to murder more. Szyk dedicates this piece, which was published in the American press. He dedicates this to the memory of his darling mother, who died somewhere, who was murdered by the Germans somewhere in the ghettos of Poland. And this image, to be shot as dangerous enemies of the Third Reich, also published in the American press. And these two young children standing before the Nazi tribunal, their images appeared regularly on magazine covers and even in the New York Times. And now, probably Szyk's single most important Holocaust work, and I will dare say the single most important work of art created during the Holocaust by any artist as a work on paper. This work of De Profundis, out of the depths, based on Psalm 130, important to both Jews in their liturgy and to Christians in their liturgy. Szyk knew exactly what he was doing when he created this work of art, calling responsibility. Who is responsible for the death for these lifeless and dying Jews? He paints Jesus among them, holding the tablets, the 10 Commandments, as if to say, were Jesus alive in 1943, he too would have been killed as a Jew. Both the title in Latin, which appeals to Jews and Christians, here the image of Jesus. What is Arthur Szyk doing? Picasso documents the tragedy of bombing of Guernica with Guernica. Chagall paints white crucifixion as a response to Kristallnacht. Szyk creates this image documenting human tragedy, but goes beyond Chagall and Picasso by calling for accountability and responsibility. Who is responsible? Cain, where is Abel thy brother? Because justice and responsibility is important to Arthur Szyk. And every work of art of his was created for the purpose of reproduction, not to be hung or match the colors of the sofa in the living room or the walls. The art was an activist artist. He wanted his art to be seen. And this work of art was reproduced in a newspaper, which you can see on the bottom right. In February of 1943, this work of art appears front and center in the Chicago Sun, full page, also with text below. The living voice of the dead calls out to us. Who put this ad in a newspaper? How did it get there? The owner of the Chicago Sun, the editor of the Chicago Sun? Which Jewish group paid for it? It wasn't paid for by any Jewish group. It was paid for by a Christian group, by a Christian textbook commission of the Protestant movement. And what did they say? They said here as part of this ad, 2 million sensitive human beings are being tortured, starved, butchered in an orgy of hate reaped by Hitler, but sown in the very soil of Christian civilization, sown in the textbooks of intolerance. this written by a Protestant group in 1943, accusing Christian textbooks in America of hate-breeding falsehoods about Jews and poisoning the lips of children by their anti-Semitic statements. And it is Arthur Szyk's art that fights hatred, mass murder abroad, but also used to address the 1940s ugly picture of anti-Semitism in America. I could talk about this in the question and answer period. Where is Arthur Szyk today? This is a man who created his art for eternity, because hatred and oppression and injustice are bitter and eternal enemies of humanity. And Szyk created his art, as he once said, "I created for permanence." This is Arthur Szyk. In April of 1943, 2 months after this appeared, on the first day of Passover, German tanks entered the Warsaw Ghetto to liquidate its residents. And Szyk chronicles the heroism of his brethren in real time in the Warsaw Ghetto, in the uprising, with his repulsed attack on the left, which was published in the press, and 2 years later, while the war is still raging on, with Samson in the ghetto, you know, the biblical narrative where Samson will take on the Philistines, the heroism of the Jews. This is an emphasis of Szyk, the activism, the heroic, to emphasize Jews must stand up. And here he goes even beyond that with the dedication, where he says on this 1945, "To the German people around the border, sons of Cain, be ye damned forever and ever. Amen." And by the way, I once, it was mentioned in the introduction, I curated an exhibition of Szyk's art in Berlin in 2008. And if you want to ask me in the Q&A, I was standing in the Deutsches Historisches Museum with German high school students, and I showed them this work of art, and I asked them, what did they think about it? And perhaps we could chat about that later. In any case, his art has a message for today, and these works have, even though we may begin to understand them a bit differently. Szyk's rage at the murder of his people is channeled towards action, not pity, as he dedicates his work, Tears of Rage, to those of my people who fight for the right to die with their boots on, my pride, my love, my devotion. This is not a pacifist. Arthur Szyk is an activist Jew. Jews must defend himself, even to the extent that he adds in parentheses, maybe hard for you to see, but he writes down here, to those of you who tuned in late. This work appeared both in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, and was sponsored by a committee for a Jewish army of stateless and Palestinian Jews. This was one of several non-sectarian groups that was organized by Peter Bergson, a Palestinian Jew who had come to America, who was not liked, neither him nor his group, of which Arthur Szyk was a prominent member, by Stephen S. Wise and the American Zionist groups, who wanted Bergson and his groups, that is, with Szyk part of them as their one-man art department, to be expelled from America because they were too activist for the American state, average American Jewish community, and the Zionist groups here. Szyk was an activist, and he sought the rescue of European Jews. And by the way, I should tell you, this group was given very little attention in all of the books written after the war. Even in the great Encyclopedia Judaica, mentions nothing, not one word about the activist Peter Bergson. And of course, Szyk was a vice president for many of Bergson's committees. This group, this was a non-sectarian group that drew support from the non-Jewish community, from congressmen such as Will Rogers Jr. and Iowa Senator Guy Gillette, journalist Pierre Van Passen, lots of non-Jews, and a young Marlon Brando. And among its own ranks were such Jews as I mentioned earlier, Ben Hecht, actor Edward G. Robinson, producer Billy Rose, who produced the 1943 pageant, We Will Never Die, held at Madison Square Garden and in 4 other cities throughout the United States. This is the cover. This is the cover of the journal. Two showings on that March day in 1943 at Madison Square Garden. 10,000 people to the first rally and 10,000 more, Eleanor Roosevelt in attendance to call urgent attention to the rescue of European Jews. His art was everywhere. And again, as I mentioned, always created for reproduction purposes, whether it was going to be poster stamps, and here such as Save Human Lives for those who supported Bergson's groups, or as other fundraising rallies and events. Here people would send out envelopes, like Easter sales, and they put Arthur Szyk's art. Every one of these poster stamps was created by him. Appearing in the New York Times on September 14th, 1943, is the Ballad of the Doomed Jews of Europe, written, the text by Ben Hecht, and the artwork by Arthur Szyk. Stephen S. Wise and many American Zionist groups were embarrassed by this. They did not want it to appear. The New York Times put a stop order on this ad. By the way, how do I even know this? Because I once owned the original work of art, and below the mat, underneath, looking at the original art, it has stamped in red, stamp, stop order. Don't publish this. That's because the pressure that was put on it. And what was it doing? It was speaking truth to power. The first paragraph only I will read to you. It says, 4 million Jews waiting for death. Oh, hang and burn, but quiet Jews. Quiet. Don't be bothersome. Save your breath. The world is busy with other news. And on and on. And the bottom left, you see Jews making an emergency telephone call. The young fellow holding the phone to his ear. The cord winding up, going past the Jews who are hanging. This published in America. The cord goes up, it winds its way up to a telephone here at the top left, above the word 4, or 4 million Jews. There's a little word there you can't see. It says ring. And here, the soldier up here, the banner across the soldier is the United Nations. And with the words, they don't pick up. Despite the war's end, misery still continued for the Jews of Europe. Szyk's lullaby for, let me see here. I might just add here, after this image, here, I just want to say, before I go on, these are the yellow badge of shame on the left. Szyk turned them around to be the yellow badge of courage when he created these medals on the right to be worn by Jews who were fighting for the creation of the Jewish state in the land of Israel. And in the badges, he added the words Al Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of his name. And despite the fact that the war had ended, misery still continued for Jews who were still in many displaced persons camps and who wished to be evacuated to Palestine. Bergson's group, the American League for a Free Palestine, for which, I guess, as I mentioned, Szyk served as vice president, called attention to these confining conditions. And here a Holocaust survivor holds in Lullaby for Dying Children, one of his children still, this is when the war is over. And who are prevented, and the child is holding in his hand one of the restrictionist policies that were directed against the Jews by the British. You can see here being clutched in his hand as they hope for new life in Palestine. And here, Szyk's pilgrims in 1946 call attention here to the Mayflower on the left and to, quotes, the illegal passenger ship that's both of them trying to break free from the yoke of the British. One in the 17th century trying to make its way to America, and the other hopeful of breaking through England's mandate over Palestine. And all the while, the British insist, as Szyk records, just on the far left, British represented by the large figure at the top, just take one more step backwards, please. just one step for the Jews trying to crawl up out of the DP camps and overcome the British monster, symbolized by John Bull at the top as they attempt to scale whatever heights are necessary to grab onto the ledge of hope and safety, reaching the land of Israel, and somebody needs to be muted.
Oppression or
whoever's talking.
But here, the British were.
Someone new who's come on is talking. Please don't. You see, even I'm getting competent.
Unmute. Unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Following the declaration of Israeli statehood on May 14th, 1948, Szyk's wife, Julia, wrote in her memoirs, this is by Szyk's wife in her memoirs, about Szyk, when Israel declared its independence, we were at home with some friends and heard the news over the radio. Arthur cried for joy, she said. It was the dream of his life that had come true. He was the happiest man in the world. He sat down the next day and he made the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. It was a magnificent scroll she wrote with all the dreams of his youth. Palestine was always his personal concern. Those who fought for it were like his own children. He felt like they belonged to him. And while Szyk went on to create works of art to support Hadassah and its youth Aliyah and Israel Bonds, he also created artwork for Israel Bonds and Youth Aliyah and Hadassah, the Magen David Adom, and he created stamps for the Jewish state. By the way, here's the image of Israel, of Albert Einstein in the press being presented with one of Szyk's Israel Bond certificates. Szyk was always deeply conscious and always deeply remembered and paid tribute to the 6 million Jews. The Hebrew word in the center, Zachor, is Szyk's Yisker. It's his remembrance. It's his reminder of the Jews of Europe, the martyred of his people, symbolized for all generations and to be an eternal memory. In a simple pen and ink drawing with the Hebrew inscription in the upper right from Deuteronomy, and God brought us out from there with a strong hand, biyad chazakav, uzroa, netiyah, and an outstretched arm. Szyk is reminding all of us of the eternal need for God and people to extend a strong hand and an outstretched arm of constant vigilance and guardianship on behalf of our people, whether it is the 14th century or the 18th century or the 20th century, the 21st century. Constant vigilance on behalf of our people. As I begin to come to a conclusion here, you're sitting very patiently during my presentation. In the foreword to the Arthur Szyk exhibition, The Art and Politics of Arthur Szyk, in the foreword to this catalog, in conjunction with the 2002 exhibit at the Holocaust Museum, its chairman, Rabbi Irvin Yitz Greenberg, wrote, and I quote, Arthur Szyk is a role model of the engaged artist who above all represents the artist as a witness against evil and for liberation. Szyk affirmed the universal cause of democracy even as he upheld, often militantly proclaimed, a distinctive Jewish history, culture, and identity. His witness, Greenberg writes, his witness rises to the level of prophecy, prophetic as to the Jewish future, but like the biblical prophets of old, carrying a powerful message for all humanity. To quote from The Art and Politics of Arthur Szyk, before his death in 1951, Szyk lived to see the defeat of the modern Amalekites and the return of the scattered remnants of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. He played a role in both by mobilizing British, Canadian, and American opinion against the Nazis and by engaging in a tireless campaign for a Jewish state. Reflecting on his friend's many contributions to the various causes of the 1940s, Ben Hecht wrote, "His Hebrews under fire, under torture, exterminated in lime pits and bonfires, did not change. They remained a people to be loved and admired. Their faces, fleeing from massacre now, were tense and still beautiful. There was never slovenly despair or hysterical agony in Szyk's dying Jews, but only courage and valor. If there was ever an artist who believed that an hour of valor was better than a lifetime of furtiveness and cringe, it was Arthur Szyk. Just as the Irgun produced the first fighting Jew since Bar Kokhba, Szyk put him on paper for the first time. He died still drawing for the Jews." And in Szyk's own words, with this very last slide that I show you, Szyk wrote on the dedication page, the concluding dedication page of his Haggadah. I began my presentation with the first page dedicated to King George. This is the last page, and there's another dedication page. And I returned to that idea, a dedication page of another kind, as Szyk wrote, "I am but a Jew, praying in art. If I have succeeded in any measure, if I've gained the power of reception among the elite of the world, I owe it all to the teachings, to the traditions, and to the eternal virtues of my people." Thank you.
Wow, that was incredible. That was so interesting. Thank you. I think we're going to open it up. I already have a lot of, can you hear me, Irvin?
I can hear you.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Oh, they're all muted though. I'm going to open this up for questions. I'm going to unmute everyone.
Also, Joanne, take speaker view or spotlight view off so we could see everybody. When we,
I have it off.
I only see you though. I put it on gallery view. Okay, good. Now I got it. Okay,
You
we
got
can see
it?
people
Okay.
raise their hands. Okay,
Okay,
great.
so I'm going to take everybody off mute.
No, not yet. What you should do is leave them on mute and do the questions in the chat and then ask people to raise their hand because then everybody starts yelling at once.
Okay.
So they should raise their hands when they want to make.
Okay, let's go to the chat first then.
Yeah.
I'm going to start at the top. Let's see. Someone says, "I love your
still
passion."
have questions. Put them in the chat right now, and then we'll open.
Yes, in questions in the chat. Someone, Gina, "I love your passion." From Michelle. Why have I never heard of him? First,
Okay. All right,
Start
shall I
with that.
answer?
Yep.
Well, I think there's a combination of things. First of all, Arthur Szyk died when he was 57. After he died, let me just simply say that during his lifetime, he was never part of any school of art, nor was there any school of Arthur Szyk. Art historians didn't write about him. I think they were afraid to try to get a handle on the magnitude and breadth and depth of his art. He wasn't written about. It's because it was believed he didn't influence any. So no one called attention to him. After he died in 1951, the family dismissed all the dealers who were working with his art because they thought they would promote his art, but then Szyk's son died and the wife couldn't carry on, and she sold off all of his original works of art at Park Bernay, and all of his works were gone in the marketplace. You had no dealers, no family, no one writing about him. His works were miniature. They were, for the most part, 6 inches by 8 inches, works on paper, watercolor and gouache, pen and ink drawings. If his De Profundis, the work I called that would have been, if his work was as large as Picasso's Guernica, going from one end of your room to the other, everyone would know who Szyk is. Some people couldn't pronounce his name, S-Z-Y-K. Many people who I talked to remember his illustrated Andersen's fairy tales from 1945 and say, oh, I remember that art. I didn't know his name. I've been in so many homes where I say, oh, have you ever heard of Arthur Szyk and his Haggadah? No, they say, and I reach for a book behind them on the shelf. I show them, this is Arthur Szyk's Haggadah. It's a combination of things. Shh. It's a combination of things that combine. I think you need to mute everyone except me, Joanne. I'm hearing people talk. I don't know.
Yeah, or Joanne, make me a co-host and I'll
I did.
lounge around for people.
So I think there's a variety of reasons we haven't heard of him, but no more, because there's been too many exhibitions, too many books, and as long as I breathe, and the internet now is going to keep him alive. There's exhibitions, plenty of talks, and he's here to stay. It's a hard question, but people haven't written about him. But I will say, it's a long answer here maybe to a short question, but Donald Cuspit, one of the leading art critics today, wrote in Art Forum that while Jackson Pollock and Ben Shahn and others may have been heard of in the 1940s, there's one artist you've never heard of who is more influential than all of them, and that's Arthur Szyk. And when a leading art critic begins to write that, you know we're on the right path.
Rabbi Ungar, what made you start to collect this art? How did you discover it?
Well, I became interested in his art actually when I got married 40 some years ago. I needed gifts for people at my wedding party. I went into a bookstore and I saw a reproduction of his Haggadah on the shelf. I bought it. I loved it. I gave it to a half dozen people in the party and I remembered it. Then I became a rabbi for 13 years and I didn't have any time to think about Arthur Szyk. In fact, as a rabbi, I didn't even have time to think, but nonetheless. But what happened was afterwards I became a rare book dealer and I rediscovered Szyk's art in an antique shop. My foot kicked some prints. I lifted them up. This is the same artist I remember from 13 years ago. And to make a long story short, everyone I told about Szyk's art, I said, this is great stuff. I discovered his political art, his anti-Nazi art. And I loved the idea that here was an artist doing biblical scenes and Jewish art, but political art as well, combining art and politics. Now people might say, don't combine art and politics, but the Bible's a book about, it's Jewish, a religious book, but it's a political book about struggle, about survival, about fighting oppression. So combining art appealed to me. And the more people I told about Szyk and the more who didn't know about him, it drove me crazy. But it drove me forward to make sure that people knew who he was. And hence that led to my collecting his art, cataloging it, making it accessible, and finding major museums that would exhibit his art and help promote it and spread the word. But I was driven because Szyk's value system is really, it's mine, but I think it's yours. It's like, care about who you are as a Jew. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Hillel said, but if I'm only for myself, what am I? Care about, use the best of Jewish tradition to contribute to humanity. This is Arthur Szyk. He raised money for the Chinese and the Czechs, the Poles, the Greeks, the tattered Brits, the New Zealand and Australian soldiers during the war. He created civil rights art in the 1940s, well before the civil rights movement. Used the Jewish tradition to create art to be an advocate for humanity at large. And always, if not now, when, in the present. I mean, how could you not embrace an artist like that? How could you not? And particularly when you then consider the genius of the art itself, the art itself. So how could I not? I mean, I know I get so excited if my wife walked in the room, say, Irv, slow down, you get a heart attack. But I'm just saying, this is who Szyk is.
Can we see any of this on the East Coast or is it just on the West Coast?
It's in institutions on the East Coast, but you know, first of all, as you know, you can't get into institutions now. And even then, it's not on permanent exhibition because they're watercolors and they're very fragile. There is an exhibition currently up on the West Coast at the Magnus Museum. But if any one of you listening or your families come to the West Coast, you are invited to come to my house. My wife isn't listening now. You are invited to come and see the Szyk original art that I have hanging here on the walls. And of course, we'll go over to the Magnus at UC Berkeley Magnus Museum, and we'll go see the collection. The collection they have is the collection I built over 25 years, which were acquired more than 3 years ago by the UC, who purchased it for, and it's there. You can read about it on the internet. I won't go into the details about that, but you could. It's
Okay.
quite exciting.
And just as an aside, Art, he says he has a copy of the New Order. He purchased it 75 years ago.
Yes, I did.
Art,
I was a teenager in Brooklyn. I was passing a bookstore on Flatbush Avenue, and it caught my eye, and I have the book right here.
fabulous. That's wonderful, Art. That's wonderful.
That's amazing.
That's amazing.
Thanks for bringing that and showing that. That was published in July of 1941, 5 months before the
Yes.
U.S. entered the war.
Yeah.
So that you
How many-
absolutely good eye.
Julia, Marion is raising her hand.
Okay,
She wants
go
to
ahead,
ask a
Marion.
question.
Go ahead.
She has to unmute. Okay, good.
I did. Did he have a lot of death threats against
The
him?
answer is when Szyk came to Canada and then the United States, newspapers carried articles. I had the newspapers that Hitler had put a personal price tag on his head. Now, whether it's true or not, and the German historians and art historians who I worked with, who were fabulous to work with, one of the best experiences of my life, they researched it in video recordings, newspapers. They could not find factually that was the case, but it meant that his art was powerful enough that everybody was writing about it. In fact, the Japanese even reproduced one of his works of art. And I have the clippings and the newspaper clippings that the Japanese saw how powerful his art was and how fearful. They used his art and reproduced it and dropped it from airplanes on American servicemen serving overseas because it showed how powerful the Japanese were as villains. So the Japanese knew about it, the Germans knew about his art, and Americans knew about it, even before he came here.
Thank you.
Michelle asks, can you talk about the anti-Semitic refugee response of the USA?
The anti-Semitic
refugee response of the USA, especially as the reality of events was known to the citizens, to the US.
Well, I can talk about the refugee response, the response to refugees through the lens of Arthur Szyk. That I can tell you. I mean, I can tell you about the books I've read too, but let me stay very Szyk focused. The group he was responsible for, a member of the Bergson group, for whom he created the ads in the newspaper, Washington Post, New York Times, etc. That group, I believe, and I've read everything you could read about it, had a great influence in the Roosevelt administration in 1944, late but nonetheless, of 1944, of creating the War Refugee Board that is credited with saving over 200,000 lives of Jews. So they're given credit in many circles for having had a direct response with regard to responding to the refugees. There's so much more to be said about it. It's a complicated question, but that's my direct Arthur Szyk response.
How many Haggadahs are left?
In 1940, the first edition was published on vellum. There were 250 copies were published, distributed in Europe and America. And then there was a popular edition, has a blue velvet cover or metal cover. Some of you may have seen it, published in Israel, 1950s, 60s, right on through the 80s, through 2000. In 2008, I did not like the translation of that Haggadah. I did not think that the art was brilliant enough. In 2008, I published an entirely new edition of that Haggadah with a new translation and commentary as a limited edition luxury book. If any of you afterwards want to contact me, they're only $8,800 each. If you want 2 or 3, I can make arrangements, but not everyone's going to call me. So in 2011, I published a user-friendly edition. It could be used at your Passover table. Abrams published it in New York with Historicana, my business, and those sell for $18. So you can get a new edition of the Szyk Haggadah with a contemporary, updated translation and commentary. I once owned 1,500 different Haggadahs and published a book about Haggadahs. I must say, the English Translation Commission for this is the best I've ever seen. Am I prejudiced? 100%. 100%.
At least, right. Can you tell us the story of the German school children? How did they react?
Thank you for asking that. And if all of you
That's from
could hold on
JC.
another 2 or 3 minutes, it's a story that's interesting, I think. What happened is that when the exhibit was up in the fall of 2008, by the way, how that exhibit ever came to pass, how an exhibition, I want to back up one step. How do you get an exhibition of the leading anti-Nazi artist in America at the most prominent museum in Germany? You know, in Berlin itself, there's over 150 museums. The German Historical Museum is the museum of the German people, of the government. It presents the honest view of Germany to the world. Whatever you think of Germany, it presents it. I've been there several times, talked to people, met them. In 2005, I went to Poland with my wife for an exhibit of Szyk's art touring Poland. And I said, before we go, can we go to Berlin for 2 days? I've never been there. I'd like to go there. So Margie said, okay, we'll go. I went to Berlin, but before I went to Berlin, I sent off 30 emails to German institutions with the idea that maybe one of them would respond, because I thought, what if I could get this exhibit of Szyk in Berlin? Would this be something? I got no responses. I went to Germany. My wife says, let's go visit the German Historical Museum. I said to Marge, isn't that an art and history museum? She said, yes, I'm in. We went. I asked, we were there for 2 days. I met somebody outside. I said, do you know who the director of this museum is? They says, yes, his name's Dr. Ottemeyer. I went back the next day. Marge went into the museum. I walked up to the front desk. They said, who are you? I said, I'm Irv Ungar. I'd like to meet with somebody from the director's office. She said to me under her breath, you got to be kidding me. She says, I'll call somebody in the office, sit down for 15 minutes. I sat down for 15 minutes. Nothing happened. I went back to the desk. Could you please call somebody again? She said, she gave me a look. She said, sit down. 2 minutes later, her jaw drops. She says, the director of the Deutsches Historisches Museum is on the phone. I said to myself, holy, you know what? And I said to myself, this is a man who knows all of German history, all of European history, all of Renaissance, modern art, the 500 years of art and history. He wants to talk to me. I've got 2 sentences to convince him to meet with me. And he says to me after that, come on up, I will meet you. So I go up to his office. He says to me, yes. I says, I'd like to show you something. I take out Arthur Szyk's art. I never go anywhere without carrying his art. I'll get to the high school kids in a minute. Don't worry, I won't forget. He looks at the art. He goes like this, that quick. He looks down and up. This is great art, he says to me. Who is this artist? I said, well, one of the things I told you on the phone was that it's Arthur Szyk. He was the leading anti-Nazi artist in Germany. He says, I says, you wouldn't know him. He's never been exhibited here in Germany. That's who Szyk is. He says, just a minute. He calls in somebody else. He calls in, and whose man's name's Hans. By the way, I was talking to Hans, so I was meeting now with 2 Hanses. And he says to him, look at this art. And Hans looks at the art, who's the head curator of the museum, and he says, they look at each other and say, we should exhibit Arthur Szyk's art here in this museum. We have an exhibit coming up on art and politics. Let's exhibit it. I went crazy. I was just 30 minutes off the street. And then he says, no. He says, we should have an exhibit of your artist by himself. And I go like, what are you kidding me? I'm in Germany. This is the head of the German Historical Museum. And he says, yes. And then he says to Hans, reach for this book from the shelf. And Hans pulls a book off the shelf. I don't know, something like that. This thick, I mean, it's a thick book. And we should do a catalog of your artist in German and in English. And we've never done a catalog in English. And then he goes into his pocket and he pulls something out. And I go, what's that? It's a calendar. The fall of 2008, we should have an exhibit of your artist. In the fall of 2000, and what happened was I got back home. A month later, I sent him a proposal as he requested. Dear Mr. Ungar, we will have an exhibition of your artist in the Deutsches Historisches Museum in the IMP building in 5,000 square feet in the fall of 2008. And in the fall of 2008, I went back to Berlin with my family, with Arthur Szyk's daughter, who was in her 80s, with a group. The opening was packed. Poles, Jews, Germans. It was filled. And on stage were Holocaust, were people from the Polish embassy playing music of a Holocaust survivor. Poles playing music of Jews with Germans, Jews, Poles, and Arthur Szyk's artwork in the background. And that was the opening. I turned to Arthur Szyk's daughter. I pinched myself. You can't believe this. We spend zillions of hours educating young kids and teachers and school board directors and rabbis about interfaith relations and hatred and how to turn it around. And I'm witnessing that in Germany through Arthur Szyk's art. And I went back to Berlin again because I wanted to meet with German high school kids. This takes me to the question, but you gotta see why I have to tell you the story, the background. I'm standing in front of this work because I want to film German high school kids because I want to make a major documentary someday. I've made several short ones. You can see them on the internet, but I want to make the major one that will win the Academy Award. To be right next to Simon Wiesenthal Center and Marvin Hires. They're better. I mean, he's good. That was very good. But nonetheless, I was standing with German high school kids and we're filming them. And in the middle of filming them, I'm showing them many works of art. And one of them is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And we're standing there and I read, "To the German people, sons of Cain, be ye damned forever and ever." And I said to the high school kids, "How does that make you feel?" And the two kids said to me, because they spoke English very well, that was what we wanted, English speaking kids. They said, "This does not make us feel guilty, but it does make us feel responsible. That's responsible, like something like this should never happen again." Now, does that mean every German high school kid or every Polish high school kid or every Israeli, every American thinks that way? No. But it means that art has the power to engage.
Incredible.
Wow.
Incredible.
Thank you.
Wow.
Wow. Anybody else have a question for Rabbi?
Irvin? Well, I'd like to say that, this is not a commercial. This is my book, Arthur Szyk, Soldier in Art. You can get it on Amazon, or you can go to my website of szyk.com, or you can call me from my phone number. It's on the website or whatever, and I'll inscribe a copy to you. As was mentioned in the beginning, it's a good book. I mean, it was unprejudiced. It won the National Jewish Book Award, so it's worthy. And there you will see what it means to be a soldier in art, expanding on what I've said. Hopefully I gave you a little bit of emotional injection into Szyk, and now the intellectual as part of intellectual experience, but I hope that you'll consider, you have to do something for me. I must say, you know, I've given you what I can in this hour we're together. Here's what you could do for me. After you finish, tell at least 2 people. You can tell 3 or 5. Tell at least 2 people about Arthur Szyk. Go, Google him or whatever, and send a link to somebody. We can't ignore his art. He's got something to say that we want to say as Jews, as people who have a place in the world today. I mean, you can't argue with him. He's not alive, but you can't argue with his words. So that's what you could do for me. You know, I'd love for you to buy the book just because it's a great book, but spread the word.
I've got 2 things. I want to see show of hands. Who knew something about Arthur Szyk before this, and who learned something today?
The 2 questions.
No, right.
The question is, who learned something today? Who didn't know anything about Arthur Szyk?
We didn't know anything about him.
Who didn't know anything? I knew nothing before yesterday. I knew nothing before yesterday. Fabulous. And really, I mean, I know some people have to go, but Rabbi Ungar, could you just wrap it up with how the collection got to UC Berkeley? I think people would like that. Oh, wait, Thelma has a question. Go ahead, Thelma.
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you to the rabbi. And I knew about Arthur Szyk through my in-laws, who have given us a painting of Arthur Szyk's Passover and Sukkot painting. And I also have a Passover Haggadah. So thank you for sharing all that wonderful information.
You're welcome, Thelma. Thank you for mentioning that. By the way, those paintings, those originals of those paintings of Passover and Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah, yes, and there's 6 of them. They're in the originals are in the Yeshiva University Museum in New York. I guess I could conclude with how my collection went to Berkeley.
Yeah,
But someone who identified with the values of Szyk as a proud, it says I'm muted now. No, that's not for me. Okay. And someone who identified with Szyk's support of Israel and of American democracy, became very interested over years in what I was interested in. And he was either going to give it to Berkeley or Stanford. He chose UC Berkeley because it has a very strong Israel center, despite what most people know in the East Coast as a very liberal institution. It is a liberal institution. It works both ways, being sometimes too liberal, sometimes not enough. But Szyk has a voice there, and his art is housed in a Jewish institution at the Judah Magnus Museum, which is the 3rd largest Jewish museum in the US after New York's Jewish Museum and the Skirbel in Los Angeles. And then they have the largest collection of Jewish art in America at Magnus, which is on the Berkeley campus. So Berkeley owns it. So as long as the UC system exists, Arthur Szyk's art will exist there. Any case, that's what I have to add about that. And just to simply say, thank you really for attending. I want to thank the JECC. I want to thank Wendy and the Holocaust Center for making it possible for me to really share what's my passion and my love and my life as a Jew with another Jew whose life mattered exponentially. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody unmute. Everybody unmute so we can applaud. This was
Amazing.
fabulous.
Amazing.
Amazing. Really amazing.
And thank you, Wendy and Gary.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Is there a video of the Berlin presentation, Rabbi Ungar?
No, but there are many videos. If you go to YouTube and you type in Szyk in YouTube, up will come documentary films that I've made about Szyk. Just if you Google, go again, youtube.com and type in Szyk or type in Historicana, my business, and Szyk, you'll see them. There's talks from the Library of Congress. There's talks from UC, all over the place. You'll hear, you hear me once. I don't know. It might be something new there. I don't know. We'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right, sign up for the trip to San Francisco, everybody.
Yeah. Not planned yet. Don't sign up so soon.
Bye, Marv, Maddie. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Great to see everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job.
Over here. Yeah. That was great.
It was fantastic.
20 participants, 22.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, Ruth. See you all
Bye,
next week.
bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Love to everyone.
Bye.
Sharon.
Sharon, Ruth's calling you. Ruth is blowing you kisses, Sharon.
See you too.
Oh,
Okay, everybody hang
thank
up.
you.
Come
Thank
here,
you
I get
all.
kisses. It's all good. All right, bye, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
I think you could do all, Joanne, right?
Yeah.
I'm leaving.